At the family reunion, my father asked with genuine confusion, "Aziza, baby, why did you come in an Uber? Did the car I gave you for your birthday break down?" Before I could answer, my husband said with a smirk, "That car belongs to my mother now. She needed it more." My father fell silent for a moment, and what he did next filled me with profound pride. Before we begin, friends watching this story, please leave a comment telling us which city you are watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can grow and bring you even more interesting stories. That afternoon, the main house of the King family was wrapped in a warm but imposing atmosphere. The grand mansion, a marvel of modern architecture, buzzed with the aroma of delicious soul food emanating from the central hall and the laughter of relatives. It was the monthly family reunion, an event the relatives always looked forward to with longing. In the spacious gravel driveway, a fleet of foreign luxury cars was parked in perfect order. From the latest European sedans to massive SUVs costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, they all gleamed, reflecting the rays of sunlight filtering through the dark clouds that had suddenly covered the clear sky. Inside, uncles, aunts, and cousins enjoyed a buffet served by the city's finest catering company. However, amidst all that opulence, a chair at the head table, right next to Romello, was empty. Romello, seated comfortably in his carved teak chair, showed no sign of waiting for his wife, who had not yet arrived. On the contrary, he was completely absorbed in enjoying a Wagyu steak on his plate. Occasionally, he would let out a loud laugh at a joke from his cousin. Dressed in a branded silk shirt and a flashy gold watch, he tried hard to fit in with his wife's family, a family of tycoons in their own right. Romello always felt he had to prove he deserved to be there, even though everyone in that room knew his management position at the company was a gift from his father-in-law, President Thaddeus King. His attitude, overly confident and somewhat arrogant, often made some relatives uncomfortable, but they kept silent out of respect for Mr. King, known for his patience and wisdom. Outside the high walls of the estate, a dark blue Uber pulled up slowly. A light drizzle was beginning to fall, dampening the hot asphalt. The car door opened, and out stepped Aziza. She looked beautiful but seemed a bit overwhelmed. The driver's card reader wasn't working, so she had to rummage through her purse to pay for the ride in cash. Then she rushed out, covering her head with her purse, to keep her pastel-toned dress from getting soaked. There was no personal chauffeur to open the door for her, nor an umbrella to welcome her. Aziza ran across the wide courtyard toward the main entrance, passing her family's luxurious cars. When she reached the imposing front door, she was slightly breathless. She fixed her clothes, brushed the raindrops from her shoulders, and after a deep breath to calm herself, entered the lion's den full of inquisitive stares. A brief silence fell over the central hall when Aziza entered. Before the murmur of conversations resumed, though notably quieter, all eyes were on her. Aziza's appearance was simple but elegant, in stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her. Her face showed fatigue. Dark circles betrayed her exhaustion, although she tried to hide it with a faint smile. She approached her father, President King, who presided over the table as the family patriarch. Mr. King observed his daughter with a sharp gaze, but one full of love. He noticed that her shoes were slightly stained by the rain and that the hem of her dress was damp. His paternal instinct immediately detected the trouble his daughter had been trying to hide. Mr. King slowly set down his spoon, and the delicate sound it made seemed to resonate with special force in the ears of everyone present. He looked at Aziza, who had just kissed his hand respectfully, and then shifted his gaze to Romello, who continued chewing his food with delight, without having bothered to stand up or pull out the chair for his wife. Mr. King cleared his throat softly, and that was enough for the conversation at the table to cease completely. With his baritone voice, calm but commanding, he asked a question, a simple question that would change his son-in-law's destiny forever. He asked why Aziza had arrived late and why she looked soaked, as if she had come by public transit, especially when he had just given her a very special birthday gift for her comfort. Mr. King asked with feigned curiosity about the whereabouts of the brand-new Mercedes-Benz S-Class he had sent her the previous week. Had it perhaps broken down, forcing Aziza to take a rideshare in the bad weather? Aziza remained silent. Her lips trembled slightly. She still hadn't found the right phrase to cover up her husband's behavior, as she didn't want to embarrass him in front of the whole family. Aziza was an obedient wife. She always tried to protect her husband's reputation, even though her heart often broke. However, before a single word could leave Aziza's mouth, Romello interrupted the conversation. With his mouth half full, with a very relaxed attitude and no trace of guilt, Romello answered his father-in-law's question. He said loudly that the Mercedes-Benz S-Class was now in the hands of his mother, Ms. Corinne. Romello explained, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world, that his mother needed a large, luxurious car so as not to be looked down upon by her friends at the Church Society Club. He added an argument that made the blood of those listening boil, that Aziza, who only went to the office and dressed simply, should live modestly, and that using an Uber was more practical and convenient since she didn't have to look for parking. The room went even quieter than before. Uncles and aunts looked at each other in disbelief. They knew the car was a personal gift from Mr. King to his only daughter Aziza, not for his son-in-law's mother, who was famous for her vanity. Romello's words were not only disrespectful, but they showed a total disregard for his wife and a lack of awareness of his place before the person who had given the gift. Aziza lowered her head, holding back extreme shame. She wasn't ashamed of having come in a taxi, but that her husband was exhibiting his stupidity with such pride in front of her own father. She clutched the hem of her dress, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her. Her heart ached to hear how her husband prioritized his mother's image over his wife's comfort. However, Mr. King's reaction was completely unexpected for Romello. Aziza's father didn't slam the table, didn't shout, didn't even flush with anger. Mr. King remained silent for a moment, observing his son-in-law as if he were examining a strange insect. Then a faint smile appeared on his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He nodded slowly, as if he understood the twisted logic Romello had just exposed. With a neutral tone, Mr. King said that he now understood that Ms. Corinne was using the car and that he appreciated Romello's honesty. Romello, interpreting his father-in-law's reaction as a sign of approval, or at least the helplessness of an old man before the younger generation, smiled smugly. He felt victorious, as if he had managed to handle his wife's family assets without any resistance. Under the table covered with a silk tablecloth, Mr. King's hand moved slowly to take his smartphone out of his pocket. Without even looking at the screen, his fingers opened a family messaging app and typed a brief order for his company's security and operations team. Not many words were needed. A single sentence was enough to activate the asset recovery protocol. The message was sent instantly, unleashing a destructive storm upon Romello and his mother. Mr. King put his smartphone back, lifted his coffee cup, and took a sip with delight, as if he had just signed a very lucrative business contract. His eyes rested gently on Aziza, sending her a silent signal that everything would be okay, that her father had the situation under control. Romello, oblivious to everything, continued eating avidly, unaware that the sword of Damocles hung over his head, ready to cut his arrogance at the root. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a contrasting scene was unfolding at a luxury shopping mall, the meeting point for the city's high society. Not even the cloudy sky could dampen Ms. Corinne's desire to show off her new toy. In the valet zone of the majestic main lobby, a gleaming black Mercedes-Benz S-Class was parked, deliberately a bit crooked so everyone would see it. Ms. Corinne stood next to the car with her chin held high. She was dressed from head to toe in colors that didn't match. In a clumsy attempt to flaunt luxury brand logos, an imitation crocodile skin purse hung from her arm, and her fingers were loaded with excessively shiny gold rings. Around her, 5 of her friends from the social club observed her with varied expressions, some with admiration, others with envy, and some who, knowing the modest origins of Corinne's family, snickered discreetly. But today, the stage belonged to Corinne. She raised her voice on purpose to recount that this car, big and magnificent, was a special gift from her dear son Romello. She bragged that Romello's business was booming, so much so that he was able to buy her this car worth nearly $150,000 in cash, no installments. She patted the hood of the car as if patting her son on the back, boasting about the comfortable heated and ventilated seats and the state-of-the-art audio system. She didn't mention Aziza's name at all, as if her daughter-in-law had contributed nothing to her son's success. Her friends showered her with feigned praise, which inflated Corinne's ego even more. They praised what a good son Romello was, and how lucky Corinne was to have a son so successful and respectful of his parents. Corinne absorbed all the flattery like a sponge, feeling on top of the world. She even allowed herself to throw a hint at one of her friends, who had arrived in an older sedan, suggesting it was time to change cars for safety and comfort. Satisfied after almost half an hour of exhibition, Corinne finally decided to end the gathering. She said goodbye as elegantly as possible, saying she had to go to her usual beauty salon for a facial. Corinne pressed the button on the handle to open the car door and slid into the cool interior that smelled of new leather. She sat in the driver's seat, straightening her back to appear taller, and waved once more to her friends, who were still on the lobby sidewalk observing her departure. With total confidence, Corinne pressed the start button. But that was where her nightmare began. Instead of the smooth purr of the engine, a long, sharp, deafening alarm sounded. The instrument panel that normally glowed with futuristic graphics turned completely red. All the warning lights flashed at the same time like the lights of a broken disco, creating an atmosphere of panic in the confined cabin. Before Corinne could understand what was happening, the automated voice of the car's computer system resonated loudly through the premium speakers she had bragged about so much. The voice was cold, monotone, and robotic, but the message was very clear. Alert! Unauthorized use of an asset detected. Security system activated. Engine permanently locked by administrator. The voice repeated over and over. Corinne panicked, pressed the start button repeatedly, stomped on the brake pedal, and even hit the steering wheel with her palms, but the car was completely dead, like an expensive piece of scrap metal. Her face began to pale, and a cold sweat ran down her forehead, ruining her thick makeup. The situation became even more humiliating when the car's security system started honking the horn at regular intervals like an anti-theft alarm. The loud sound resonating throughout the high-ceilinged mall lobby attracted everyone's attention. The mall security guards, passing visitors, Uber drivers, and of course Corinne's friends who hadn't left yet, looked toward the Mercedes. Corinne's friends who previously admired her now began to whisper and hold back laughter as they watched Corinne like a fish in a bowl, frantically hitting the glass from the inside. Corinne tried to open the door to escape the shame, but the central locking system, remotely controlled by Mr. King's IT team, had automatically locked her in. She was trapped in her own luxury car, turned into a free show for hundreds of pairs of eyes. At the headquarters of Mr. King's company, a young IT specialist watched his monitor with an impassive face. He had just executed a priority order from the company owner. On his screen, the status of the vehicle with that license plate read, "Locked. User unauthorized." The employee typed the next command. Unlock doors after a 3-minute interval for maximum psychological impact, and simultaneously send the current location signal to the asset recovery team already on standby in the area. In the distance, in the mall lobby, those 3 minutes felt like 3 years to Corinne. She saw her friends take out their phones, not to help, but to record the ridiculous incident. She screamed for help, but her voice was drowned out by the car's soundproof glass. She cried hysterically. Her eye makeup ran, turning into a black liquid streaking down her cheeks, destroying the image of the high society lady she had tried so hard to build. When the door locks finally released automatically with a loud click, Corinne didn't get out immediately. She was too exhausted and in shock. But she had no choice, because in the distance, a bright orange tow truck with a large corporate logo was already entering the lobby area, making its way through the crowd. The employees who stepped out of the truck were not typical disheveled operators, but two security agents, robustly built with determined faces, dressed in black tactical uniforms. They carried a folder with legal asset seizure documents and walked with a firm step directly toward Corinne's car. It was then that Corinne realized this wasn't a simple engine failure. It was a counterattack, and she was on the front line of the battlefield, with no weapon other than her already shattered pride. The atmosphere in the mall lobby, normally bustling with visitor activity, had now transformed into a stage of tension and comedy. The arrival of the huge orange tow truck, with its emergency lights spinning silently, parted the crowd like Moses parting the sea. On both sides of the truck, the name of the business conglomerate King Enterprises Property was clearly inscribed, a name highly respected in the American business world. The two burly security agents who stepped down from the truck were not just any operators. They wore impeccable black uniforms with the company insignia on their chests and communication earpieces. Their faces were blank, cold, and professional, and there was not an ounce of hesitation in their steps as they headed toward the Mercedes-Benz S-Class, stalled in the middle of the VIP drop-off zone. Corinne was still trapped in the car, breathing with difficulty. The tinted windows prevented her from clearly seeing the expressions of the people outside, but she could feel the hundreds of pairs of eyes fixed on her. Her heart pounded, a mixture of fear and the pride she still had left. One of the security agents tapped firmly on the driver's window, startling Corinne. She tried to scream at them to leave, but her voice didn't penetrate the glass. The agent wasted no time. He took out a small electronic device and held it near the door handle. Immediately, the car lock opened with a loud click. The driver's door swung wide open, letting in the warm lobby air and the murmur of the crowd into the cool cabin. The security agent leaned in slightly, but there was no trace of kindness in his tone. He asked Ms. Corinne to exit the vehicle, as they needed to secure the company asset immediately. Corinne, feeling her pride trampled, exploded in anger. She clung to the steering wheel with all her might and refused to move. With a cracking voice, she shouted that the car belonged to her son, Romello, and that no one had the right to take it from her. She threatened to call the police and report them for theft. Corinne's hysterical screams echoed against the lobby ceiling, and mall visitors moved even closer to see who this middle-aged woman causing such a scene was. Several people took out their phones, activated the camera function, and began recording the embarrassing incident in real time. The security agent didn't get carried away by emotions. Calmly, he took out a plastic folder containing official documents. He showed the stamped and signed asset recovery order. With a voice loud enough for the front row of the crowd to hear, he explained that the vehicle in question was registered as an operating asset of Mr. Thaddeus King's company, and that at that moment it was being misused by a person without written authorization. The words company asset and misused resonated in the ears of Corinne's friends who were still standing on the sidewalk, stunned. Their expressions changed from confusion to contempt. The rumor began to spread that the luxury car Corinne bragged about so much was actually her daughter-in-law's father's company car, not the fruit of her son's success. As Corinne continued to resist and refuse to get out, the security agents finally took firm measures following protocol. One agent signaled to his partner. With agility, but without hurting her, they pried Corinne's hands off the steering wheel. Corinne kicked like a spoiled child. Her feet flailed in the air, but the strength of a middle-aged woman who barely exercised was no match for two trained guards. In a matter of seconds, Corinne was dragged out of the car. She stumbled and would have fallen to the asphalt if she hadn't grabbed a lobby pillar to keep her balance. Her imitation purse fell, and its contents spilled onto the floor. Cheap lipstick, crumpled tissues, and a bulging wallet containing only old receipts. The next scene was the culmination of all the humiliation. The tow truck operator quickly hooked the front bumper of the Mercedes. The towing machinery roared and gently lifted the massive car onto the truck bed. Corinne ran and banged on the side of the truck, crying and begging them not to take the car. She screamed Romello's name, as if her son were going to suddenly appear to save her, but no hero arrived. The truck drove away slowly, taking with it the symbol of social status Corinne felt so proud of. She was left alone in the middle of the driveway. Her hairstyle, once so elaborate, was now undone, and the running mascara gave her a ghostly appearance in broad daylight. No one around helped her. They were too busy uploading videos of the incident to social media. One of Corinne's friends, a woman with a sharp tongue, whom Corinne had previously despised for her old car, approached with a sarcastic smile. She didn't offer a hand to help Corinne up, but simply said in a low but cutting voice, "It seems your son's car had a business emergency. Why don't you order an Uber?" The comment provoked giggles among the other friends. Corinne looked around with glassy eyes. Her world, built on lies, was crumbling. A visitor's phone pinged with a notification, a video of Ms. Corinne being dragged out by security guards, uploaded to the city's gossip account, reached thousands of views in minutes. The headline was painfully cruel. High society ladies flex turns out to be in-laws company lease. Back at the King Mansion, the atmosphere of the party remained serene, in stark contrast to the chaos that had just occurred at the mall lobby. A soft piano melody played in the background for guests enjoying dessert. Aziza sat silently in her chair. Her eyes stared at the empty plate in front of her, trying to ignore the sound of her husband chewing beside her, still avidly. Romello seemed very relaxed. Occasionally he let out a small burp without covering his mouth, feeling like a little king in his father-in-law's house, having successfully answered Mr. King's question without any argument. He didn't know the calm in that room was the calm before a great storm. Suddenly, Romello's phone on the table vibrated violently with a loud ringtone. The sound broke the serenity of the room, and several uncles turned with annoyed expressions. Romello quickly grabbed the phone and saw the name Mom on the screen. He smiled broadly, thinking his mother was calling to thank him for letting her show off the new car. Confidently, Romello answered the call without getting up from the table, so everyone could hear his conversation. But the smile disappeared from Romello's face in an instant. The voice that came from the other side was not one of gratitude, but a hysterical scream mixed with inconsolable crying. Ms. Corinne's voice was so loud that even Aziza, sitting next to him, could hear it faintly. Romello's face flushed with shame and then paled with anger. He listened to his mother's breathless account, that the car had been forcibly towed by some thugs, that she had been humiliated in front of her friends, and that she was now abandoned on the street. Romello's narrow mind immediately concluded that this was all Aziza's doing. He thought Aziza, hurt, had secretly called the police or canceled the car insurance. Rage consumed him. Romello threw his spoon onto the plate, making a clattering noise, and the whole room went silent instantly. He stood up abruptly. His chair scraped the marble floor with a loud screech. With bulging eyes, Romello pointed at Aziza's face, who remained seated silently. He screamed at his wife in front of dozens of relatives present. He accused Aziza of being an ungrateful wife who had humiliated her mother-in-law. Romello shouted, asking what Aziza had done to have the car taken away. The veins in Romello's neck bulged. His face was ready to utter all kinds of insults. Aziza raised her head and looked at her husband with an indecipherable expression, a mixture of pity and exhaustion. But before she could open her mouth to defend herself, a baritone voice cut through Romello's anger like a hot knife cuts butter. Mr. King had risen from his seat at the head of the table. His movements were slow and deliberate, but he had an aura that left everyone breathless. He didn't shout, didn't slam the table. He simply raised a hand slightly to signal Romello to shut up. Surprisingly, Romello, who was furious, fell silent. His mouth remained slightly open. Mr. King walked around the table. His steps were firm as he approached his son-in-law. He stopped exactly 2 steps from Romello and looked him in the eye with a sharp, piercing gaze, the look of a businessman who had broken many competitors. With a neutral tone, Mr. King said there was no problem with the car. He explained that the car had been recovered because its original owner, the company, had determined that the current user was not qualified. Romello opened his mouth, trying to process his father-in-law's words. Mr. King continued, this time with an even colder tone. He said that since he had heard Romello's mother needed a car, Romello should go see her immediately as she was suffering in the heat on the street. Romello, bewildered, tried to excuse himself, saying he had to go back to the office, but Mr. King interrupted him again. With deadly calm, Mr. King informed Romello of a new reality. He asked for the keys to the sedan Romello had arrived in, the company car he had been using for his affairs. Romello, reflexively grabbing his pants pocket, hesitated to hand over the keys. Mr. King sketched a slight, terrifying smile. He said the car was an employee benefit, and since as of 5 o'clock that afternoon, Romello's name had been removed from the company's employee list for serious ethical violations and asset abuse, Romello no longer had a right to that car. The news of the firing was communicated as if Mr. King were talking about the weather in the middle of a family meal. The color drained from Romello's face, and his legs went weak. He looked at Aziza's uncles and aunts for support, but they all looked at him with contempt and coldness. No one felt pity for him. Mr. King extended his hand, demanding the keys. With trembling hands, Romello rummaged in his pocket and handed over the keys to the sedan. It was as if he were handing over his own life. Without that car and that job, he was nothing. But the humiliation wasn't over yet. Mr. King took a bill out of his pocket, a $50 bill. He folded the bill carefully and tucked it into the pocket of Romello's expensive shirt. Mr. King patted the pocket and then whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear, that the money was for him to catch a cab. A luxury Uber was too expensive, and Romello should learn to save, as he had said earlier about Aziza. Mr. King nodded to the head of security of the house, who was waiting in a corner of the room. 2 robust house guards approached. They didn't touch Romello roughly. They simply stood on either side of him, exerting strong psychological pressure for him to leave immediately. Romello looked at Aziza one last time, hoping his wife would defend him, but Aziza had already turned away. She was busy pouring hot tea for her mother, acting as if Romello were no longer there. With a hesitant step and shattered pride, Romello was expelled from that magnificent dining room, passing by the delicious food he hadn't finished, toward the exit. Behind him, the family conversation slowly resumed, as if a piece of trash blocking the view had just been put in its place. When Romello walked out the main door of the King mansion, every step he took was a mixture of explosive rage and heartbreaking shame. The 2 burly security guards escorting him followed him to the high wrought iron gate. They didn't say a word, but their looks screamed that Romello was now nothing more than trash, to be removed immediately from that luxurious property. When the automatic gate closed slowly behind him with a heavy metallic sound, Romello felt as if the door to a life of comfort had closed forever. He stood stunned on the sidewalk outside, looking back at the imposing house, whose lights shone warmly, the place where he should have been enjoying the rest of the evening as a beloved son-in-law, not as a fired and banished man. The sky, which had been cloudy, finally unleashed its contents. It wasn't a drizzle, but a cold, intense downpour. It was as if nature itself were joining Romello's humiliation party. Romello hurriedly took shelter under a tree on the side of the road, whose leaves weren't dense enough to protect him from the water's attack. The expensive silk shirt, bought with Aziza's supplementary credit card, was now soaked and clinging to his skin. Desperate, he searched his pants pockets and took out his smartphone, its screen slightly wet from raindrops. With trembling fingers, he opened the rideshare app. He had to get out of there quickly before a neighbor or acquaintance of his father-in-law saw him standing on the street like a beggar. But a new problem arose. The luxury gated community where Mr. King lived had very strict security rules. The app on Romello's phone showed a notification that no driver could enter that private residential zone to pick him up without an access permit from the owner. Romello tried calling the security booth at the entrance, hoping they would open the barrier for a car, but his call was rejected. His number had evidently been blocked or marked to be ignored. He had no other choice. Romello had to walk to the main entrance of the community, almost a mile and a half from where he was. A distance he would normally cover in a few minutes in an air-conditioned car now stretched before him like a torture path. Romello began to walk with heavy steps. His gleaming leather shoes stepped into dirty puddles on the asphalt. Every step was pain for his ego. The rain intensified, and a strong wind made the trees sway violently. In less than 5 minutes, Romello was completely soaked. His hair, previously styled with gel, now hung limp over his forehead. Rain ran down his face, hiding the tears of rage starting to well up. He cursed Aziza in his mind. He cursed Mr. King. He felt treated unjustly. In his twisted logic as a son-in-law, he had a right to enjoy those comforts, and his father-in-law's anger was excessive for a simple car. He didn't realize the real problem was his own audacity accumulated over years. As Romello staggered under the storm, bright car headlights illuminated his back. Romello stepped to the edge of the curb, hoping it was just a passing neighbor, but the car slowed down as it approached him. It was a large pearl-white SUV, the same type that had been confiscated from his mother that afternoon, but this one was brand new. The license plate was still temporary. Romello turned with the hope of finding a little compassion. Maybe Mr. King had changed his mind and asked his chauffeur to take him to the entrance. The car windows were spotless, treated with the best water-repellent coating, so Romello could clearly see who was inside. Behind the wheel was Mr. King. The middle-aged man drove relaxedly with one hand on the wheel. His face was serene and dry, enjoying the classical music faintly audible from the outside. Next to him sat Aziza. His wife had changed into warmer clothes. Aziza held a thermos with a hot drink. Her face looked peaceful. Time seemed to slow down as the car passed slowly by Romello. Romello stared at his wife's face, hoping Aziza would turn, see her husband shivering with cold, and ask her father to stop. But that hope was shattered. Aziza looked straight ahead. Her gaze was empty, as if Romello were an unimportant object on the road, like a streetlight or a trash can. There was no hatred in Aziza's eyes, only absolute indifference. The car accelerated again. Its tires passed through a deep puddle, splashing brown mud onto Romello's already soaked pants. Romello stood there soaked in mud and rainwater, staring stunned as the taillights of that luxury car disappeared around the corner toward the exit gate. He stood alone, feeling a cold that soaked him to the bone. An hour later, Romello finally arrived at the rental apartment he had called home, although both the rent and bills were paid by Aziza. His body shook violently, and his lips were blue. He slammed the door entering, hoping to find some warmth or at least a place to vent his emotions, but the scene that greeted him in the living room only caused him an even bigger headache. The house was a mess. Curled up on the living room sofa was Ms. Corinne. Her hair was messy, and streaks of running mascara still stained her cheeks. His mother was also soaked. Apparently, she had had trouble getting decent transportation from the mall. Seeing Romello arrive home in an equally pitiful state, Ms. Corinne, instead of asking how he was or bringing him a towel, immediately stood up and unleashed her fury. She pointed at Romello's face and screamed, asking where his responsibility as a son was. Ms. Corinne retold the tragedy at the mall, exaggerating how she had been treated like a criminal and turned into the laughingstock of the entire city. She blamed Romello for not controlling his wife, accusing him of being too soft on Aziza, which had given the daughter-in-law the courage to commit the disrespectful act of recovering the company car. Ms. Corinne's high-pitched screams filled the not very large apartment, making Romello's ears ring. Physically and mentally exhausted, Romello couldn't take it anymore. For the first time in his life, he responded to his mother's screams. He threw his briefcase on the floor and shouted that all this had happened because of his mother's greed and her desire to show off. Romello said that because his mother hadn't been able to keep her mouth shut about the car's ownership, he had been fired, kicked out, and humiliated in front of Mr. King's entire family. Miss Corinne fell silent for a moment upon hearing the word fired, eyes wide. But that woman's ego was too big to admit a mistake. Instead, she flipped the script. She said the firing wouldn't have been a problem if Romello were truly as successful and rich as he had always bragged. The fight between mother and son continued with fury, blaming each other and bringing up dirty laundry they had kept hidden under the mask of a harmonious and prosperous family. The argument only stopped when their stomachs growled loudly in unison. Hunger overcame emotion. They realized they hadn't eaten anything since noon. The luxury food at Mr. King's party was a distant memory, and Ms. Corinne, too busy showing off, hadn't had lunch at the mall either. Hunger, combined with stress and the exhaustion of being soaked by the rain, felt painful. Romello let out a long sigh, trying to swallow his pride. He sat on the sofa, wet from his clothes, and took out his phone again. He planned to order a bunch of expensive fast food to relieve stress. He thought a delicious meal might at least comfort this bad day a little. Romello opened a food delivery app. His fingers quickly selected the family meal from his favorite fried chicken spot. He added several sides and a large drink. The total bill came to almost $30. Without hesitation, he pressed the order button and selected the credit card payment method saved in the app. The loading circle spun on the phone screen. Romello swallowed, imagining the hot, crispy chicken. But instead of an order accepted notification, a red error message appeared on the screen. Transaction failed. Payment declined by card issuer. Romello frowned. He thought it might be a network glitch. He tried again. This time, he used his second credit card, the platinum card he always bragged about to his friends. The result was the same. Rejected. A cold sweat began to form on his temples, mixing with the rainwater that hadn't yet dried. He tried all the cards he had registered: debit, shopping, digital wallet. One by one, they all rejected the transaction. It was then that reality hit him hard. He had just remembered that all those cards were supplementary authorized user cards, whose primary account was Aziza's payroll account. All this time, Aziza had financed his lifestyle, and Romello had simply swiped the card. Romello's fingers trembled violently. He opened his mobile banking app to check the balance of his personal account, his salary account from working at Mr. King's company. The number that appeared on the screen left him helpless. $150. That was all the money he had earned by himself. The rest had already been spent last month on installments for his mother's appliances, and that account, furthermore, would likely be about to be frozen since he had been fired. Romello looked at Miss Corinne with a pale face. He stammered that he couldn't use any of the cards, that Aziza had blocked everything. Ms. Corinne screamed in frustration and threw a sofa cushion at Romello, lamenting her fate of having to go hungry in her own home. As if that suffering weren't enough, suddenly a sharp, continuous beep was heard from the electricity meter outside the house. It was the warning sound that the prepaid electricity balance was at a critical level. Romello and Ms. Corinne looked at each other with eyes full of fear. All this time, the meter had always been recharged automatically by Mr. King's personal assistant, who managed logistics for his children. Now there were no such facilities. That beep sounded like the countdown of a ticking time bomb. Romello reached into his pocket for the cash Mr. King had given him earlier. The $50 bill was soaked and crumpled. Before he could even think about running to the corner store to buy a recharge card, a loud click was heard. Instantly, all the lights in the house went out. The fan stopped, and the TV went black. Total darkness enveloped them. The rental apartment plunged into total darkness, illuminated only by occasional lightning seen through the window. In that darkness, Miss Corinne's sobs could be heard. She had started crying like a scared child. Romello leaned back on the sofa in the dark, stomach aching from hunger, body shivering with cold, and wallet empty. That night, for the first time in his pampered life, Romello felt what true poverty was: no food, no light, and no way out. The next morning, the sun shone brightly, in stark contrast to the gloomy atmosphere of Romello's rental apartment, still plunged in darkness due to the lack of electricity. With the fan and AC off all night, Romello woke up with his body sticky with sweat. He opened his eyes with a pounding headache. The remnants of stress and hunger from the night before still tormented his body. There was no breakfast prepared on the table, nor the aroma of coffee the service staff used to prepare. And worst of all, the water pump also depended on the cut electricity, so no clean water came out of the bathroom faucet. Forced by circumstances, Romello cleaned himself with the water remaining in the tub, already cloudy, and put back on the work shirt he had soaked the day before. The shirt, now dry, was wrinkled and smelled musty, and the mud stains on the pants were barely disguised despite having rubbed them with a damp cloth. He looked in the broken mirror in a corner and saw his disheveled reflection, eyes red from lack of sleep and careless stubble. However, his enormous ego still pushed him to go to the office. In his mind, which still denied reality, he thought yesterday's firing was just an emotional threat from Mr. King. He was convinced that if he went and apologized, or at least showed a dedicated work attitude, his father-in-law would soften. The commute to work, which he normally did comfortably in an air-conditioned sedan, became torture. Romello had to walk to the main road and squeeze onto a crowded city bus, full of the smell of sweat from thousands of other passengers. He stood pressed near the door, trying to avoid getting his shoes stepped on and holding back nausea caused by an empty stomach. Upon arriving at the financial district downtown, Romello walked with forced uprightness toward the skyscraper owned by Mr. King. He fixed his shirt collar, trying to regain the dignity he had already lost. But the looks from some of his former colleagues he crossed on the sidewalk were different. They didn't greet him. Instead, they looked away or looked at him with mockery while whispering. Apparently, rumors about what happened at the party and his mother's viral video had spread faster than his steps. Romello entered the majestic lobby of the building with its gleaming marble floor. He headed toward the automated turnstiles and took out the employee badge hanging from his neck. With a movement that had become muscle memory over the last 3 years, he swiped the card over the scanner. Normally, the light turned green and the turnstiles opened, but this time the machine emitted a long, sharp buzz, and the light turned bright red. The words, "Access denied," appeared clearly on the machine's small screen. Romello, feeling shame rise in his throat, swiped the card again. 1, 2, 3 times. The line of employees behind him began to murmur with impatience. That rejection sound was like a siren announcing his pariah status. Before Romello could hit the machine in frustration, 2 burly building security guards were already in front of him. One of them was the head of security whom Romello used to order to buy him cigarettes or carry his mother's shopping bags. But today, that guard's gaze was cold and distant, as if he were seeing a suspicious stranger. The guard didn't greet him. With a firm, neutral voice, he informed Romello that he could not enter the office area. The order came directly from the board of directors, and Romello's name was already on the building security blacklist. Romello tried to reply, shouting that he wanted to see the HR director to clear up the misunderstanding, but the guard shook his head firmly. The security guard bent down slightly and picked up a cardboard box from under the reception desk. He shoved the box abruptly against Romello's chest. Inside the box were his personal effects, removed from his desk, a photo frame of him and Aziza with the glass broken, a coffee mug that said "The Boss," a stapler, and a couple of cheap pens. On top of that pile of junk was a sealed white envelope with the company's official logo. It was the termination letter. With trembling hands, Romello opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the legal terms, harsh but deadly. The reason for dismissal was written in bold. Serious violation of ethical code, misuse of company assets, and conduct detrimental to corporate image. There was no severance pay or letter of recommendation, only a notification that they would face criminal action if he didn't return all company inventory. Romello stood stunned in the middle of the busy lobby, hugging the box like an automaton. He felt naked in front of the hundreds of people passing by. Shame burned from his face to his ears. He turned around and stumbled out of the building, moving away from the place that once gave him identity and pride. He sat on a bench in a nearby park and took out his phone. He didn't want to give up. He was sure that with his 3 years of experience in a large company, he could easily get a job elsewhere, even at a competitor of Mr. King. With the little data left on his plan, he started calling some acquaintances at rival firms. The first call was to a marketing director at another real estate firm who had tried to recruit him in the past. Romello tried to sound cheerful, greeted him friendly, and asked about his family before expressing his interest in seeking new challenges. But the voice on the other end sounded uncomfortable and rushed. The person interrupted Romello and told him bluntly that he had already heard what happened. He explained that the business sector was very small, and rumors about asset misuse were poison for anyone's reputation. No reputable company would dare hire someone who had been personally fired by Mr. Thaddeus King and had a history of questionable integrity. The person said sorry and hung up quickly. Romello called his second, third, and 10th contact. The result was the same. Some didn't answer. Others blocked his number immediately, and some told him bluntly that his name was already on the industry's HR blacklist. Mr. King had truly closed all doors on him. Romello hadn't just lost his job, he had lost his future. Under the cruel sun, Romello realized he was now unemployed with a toxic reputation, unsellable anywhere. A week had passed since the expulsion incident, and Romello's life had sunk into an even deeper pit of hardship. He and his mother survived in their dark rental apartment, selling the remaining appliances one by one, from the TV to the blender, to a neighborhood scrap dealer for a laughable price. The money was barely enough to eat a sandwich a day and buy candles for light. Amidst that despair, a process server showed up with a summons. Aziza had officially filed for divorce. Romello read the lawsuit documents with cunning eyes. His manipulative mind didn't see this as the end, but as a golden opportunity. He thought about the division of assets. During their 3 years of marriage, Aziza's wealth and Mr. King's gifts had been substantial. In Romello's logic, since he was her legal husband, he was entitled to half that fortune. Ms. Corinne, chewing on a cold sandwich in a corner, perked up hearing about the asset lawsuit. She whispered poison into her son's ear, urging him to demand a share of the luxury house they lived in, the cars, and the company shares. Ms. Corinne convinced Romello that the law would surely side with the husband and that Aziza wouldn't be cruel enough to leave her ex-husband with nothing. With the last money they had left, Romello hired a cheap lawyer with an office in a strip mall on the outskirts of the city, a lawyer who bragged more than he won cases. But Romello had no choice. He went to court with the vain confidence that he would walk out a new millionaire. The day of the trial arrived. The atmosphere in the family court was formal and cold. Romello put on the best shirt he had left, which fit a bit loosely due to the drastic weight loss of the last week, but he strove to look as pitiful as possible to gain the judge's sympathy. However, his eyes gleamed with greed. On the other side of the room, a door opened and Aziza entered. Her appearance was truly different. She was radiant, dressed in an elegant navy blue dress and a carefully knotted silk scarf. Her face was clean, serene, and emanated an aura of determination Romello had never seen before. Aziza didn't come alone. She was accompanied by the best family law firm in the country, men in expensive suits carrying leather briefcases full of documents. The trial began with the reading of the claim and response. When it came time to discuss marital assets, Romello's lawyer attacked immediately with an exorbitant demand. He demanded a division of assets worth several $1,000,000, claiming Romello had contributed to managing the family business and maintaining the stability of the home. Romello even shed crocodile tears, saying he had been kicked out inhumanely without a cent. He demanded compensation for material and moral damages. Ms. Corinne, sitting in the audience, nodded. Her eyes shone, imagining the money they would receive. But the smile of victory on Romello and his mother's faces didn't last long. Aziza's lead lawyer, a middle-aged man with thick glasses and a gaze as sharp as an eagle's, stood up silently. He didn't refute Romello's claims with emotional words, but with data. He asked the court for permission to present evidence from a forensic audit of household finances during the 3 years of marriage. The lawyer opened a large box containing a stack of bank statements, credit card bills, and transfer receipts, as thick as a brick. He began to present shocking facts. It turned out that during the marriage, Romello hadn't contributed a single cent to household expenses. His meager salary was always spent entirely on his personal expenses and Ms. Corinne's lifestyle. Worse yet, Aziza's lawyer demonstrated that all the luxurious facilities Romello and his mother enjoyed, trips abroad, Ms. Corinne's designer bags, jewelry, and even the renovation of his mother's house in her hometown, were paid for with the supplementary credit card in Aziza's name. Legally, the use of funds without written permission and outside reasonable living expenses for the couple was classified as debt. The lawyer presented a summary indicating that the total of Romello and his mother's hedonistic expenses amounted to the fantastic figure of over $300,000. The court fell silent. The figure was so large, the judge frowned and looked at Romello with inquisitive eyes. Romello paled. He tried to reply that they were gifts from his wife. But Aziza finally spoke. With a soft but firm voice, she stated under oath that she had never authorized the use of such a large sum for her mother-in-law's luxuries. She said that she, on the contrary, often had to save to finance her business. Aziza revealed she had kept silent all that time because she wanted to save her marriage. But since Romello had initiated the lawsuit for division of assets, she had the right to recover her money. Aziza's lawyer presented a counterclaim. He demanded that Romello return all the money or that assets bought with that money be seized as compensation for damages. The judge's gavel fell with a thunderous sound that sounded like a death sentence for Romello's future. The court, after examining the irrefutable evidence, decided to grant Aziza's divorce petition and dismiss all of Romello's asset division claims. Furthermore, the judge ruled that Romello's obligation to return the illegally used funds had been proven. As a guarantee, the judge ordered the seizure of any asset in the defendant's or his family's name proven to have been purchased with that flow of funds. This meant the deed to Ms. Corinne's only house in her hometown, whose mortgage had recently been paid off with Aziza's credit card money, would be seized by the state for auction. Hearing the verdict, Ms. Corinne screamed hysterically in court. Her body convulsed and her eyes bulged, as if she couldn't believe her own greed had become a boomerang destroying the last assets she owned. She fainted on the courtroom floor, causing a commotion. Romello sat motionless in his chair, his body weak, as if his bones had been removed. He looked at Aziza, hoping to see some compassion in the eyes of the woman who once loved him. But Aziza had already stood up, fixed her clothes, and walked out of the court without looking back a single time. Behind her, medical staff entered to take Ms. Corinne away. Meanwhile, Romello realized he had just dug his own grave. He had come to get rich, but he was leaving destitute with a debt of hundreds of thousands of dollars. After the judge's gavel strike in family court, Romello and Ms. Corinne's life took a 180-degree turn. The execution of the asset seizure was much faster and crueler than they had imagined. The only house in their hometown, which she had always boasted about as a symbol of her son's success, now had a flashy red sign with the words, "Seized by the state." Without a place to return to, without assets to mortgage, and without money in the bank to rent decent housing, they were left on the street. They were forcibly evicted from their previous rental apartment for not paying rent for 2 consecutive months and were now abandoned in a crowded slum on the outskirts of the city. Their new residence was at the end of a narrow, damp alley where sunlight barely reached, blocked by touching roofs. The walls of the shack were exposed brick, unplastered. The asbestos roof leaked everywhere, creating damp spots on the ceiling, and the air inside was stifling, mixed with the smell of stagnant sewage right in front of the rotting wooden door. In that cramped space, luxury was a forgotten word. There was no fluffy spring mattress to comfort their backs, no air conditioning to cool their skin. Only a thin mat on the cold concrete floor served as a bed for both. Every night they had to sleep hungry, accompanied by the buzzing of fierce mosquitoes and the noisy sound of rats running across the roof. Ms. Corinne, who once always looked splendid thanks to $1,000 facials and designer clothes, now looked like a completely different person. Her face was dull and greasy, and stress lines caused by malnutrition began to appear prominently and deeply. Her hair, always carefully styled in expensive salons, now often hung limp and smelled musty, tied carelessly with a rubber band from a food package. There were no more high society friends to praise her, only neighbors who looked at her with suspicion. Every day Ms. Corinne had to get up before dawn, not to do her usual morning exercise or prepare for a social club meeting, but because she had started working as a washerwoman for her neighbors, most of whom were factory workers. To avoid starving, this fake ex-society lady had to lower herself to do the hard labor she once deeply despised. Her hands, once soft and holding only porcelain teacups, were now rough, calloused, and cracked from exposure to cheap detergent that burned her skin. She often cried alone in public bathrooms while scrubbing stains from other people's clothes, lamenting her fate of having to become the servant of people she once considered low status. But her neighbors showed her no compassion. On the contrary, they often mocked and scolded her for her slow and unclean work, and for still complaining about the quality of the laundry soap. Romello's situation wasn't much better. In fact, one could say he suffered a more severe mental breakdown than his mother. The college degree from a prestigious university, which he once felt proud of every time he applied for a job, was now worth less than fast food wrapping paper. The stigma of being a dishonest employee, an embezzler of assets, and a person fired dishonorably from Mr. King's major company caused him to be instantly rejected by all corporations. Even small businesses needing administrative staff were reluctant to hire someone with a history of integrity as bad as Romello's. The corporate world had firmly closed its doors to him. Finally, to eat, Romello had to swallow the enormous pride he once held. He accepted odd jobs as a loader at the city's central produce market. Every night until dawn, Romello had to transport 100-pound sacks of rice, vegetables, and onions from delivery trucks to merchants' stalls. His back, which once rested comfortably in an ergonomic chair in an air-conditioned office, was now scratched, bruised, and hunched from bearing heavy loads that tortured his spine. His skin, once carefully groomed, was now sunburnt, dark, greasy, and full of dirt that was hard to remove even with soap. His feet, once wrapped in gleaming leather shoes, now only wore thin, patched flip-flops, walking on the wet market floor full of rotting trash. Romello often had to fight with stronger porters for a loading job and was frequently pushed and fell into the mud, becoming the laughingstock of the market people, who didn't know he was once an arrogant young executive. Whenever Romello returned to the shack with a wrecked body and barely enough change to buy a couple of sandwiches with some bologna, the atmosphere at home, far from offering the peace of rest, greeted him with a new hell. The fights between mother and son became an inevitable routine. Ms. Corinne, unable to accept her hard life, kept blaming Romello for all her suffering. With a shrill voice, she cursed Romello for being a useless and stupid son who hadn't known how to take care of his rich, good wife, Aziza. She kept bringing up the past, saying that if Romello had been smarter to gain Mr. King's favor and hadn't been so honest about the car, they wouldn't have ended up in this dump. Blind, exhausted physically and mentally, he no longer accepted the reproaches as he did when he was an obedient son. His respect for his mother had been completely eroded by bitter reality. He responded to his mother's insults with much crueler and hurtful words. He shouted in her face that all this was karma for Ms. Corinne's arrogant mouth and ostentatious lifestyle, wanting to look rich with a stolen Mercedes. Romello blamed his mother's greed for pushing him to commit petty corruption and lies that finally made him lose his job, his wife, and his future. His screams of hate often ended with breaking plastic plates or slamming doors, causing the next-door neighbors to bang on the wall and threaten to kick them out if they kept making noise in the middle of the night. In that narrow, hot, and stifling space, the affection between mother and son had disappeared without a trace, replaced by mutual hatred, blame, and deep regret that was already too late to fix. They were trapped together in the pit of poverty they had dug themselves, with no hope of ever getting out. 5 years is not a short time for the wheel of fate to make a complete turn. A year had passed since the storm of ruin hit Romello and his mother, erasing every trace of the false luxury they once enjoyed. Time marched on, indifferent to their miserable fate. On the other hand, for those who were patient and honest, time brought sweet rewards. That afternoon, at a fine dining restaurant located in the most exclusive business district, the atmosphere was cool, calm, and elegant. The restaurant was known as a meeting place for successful entrepreneurs and high society. The marble floor gleamed, reflecting the light of crystal chandeliers, and the aroma of prime steaks and gourmet coffee filled the air, perfectly climate-controlled by a central AC system. Soft, instrumental jazz music played in the background, adding a touch of class to the place. At one of the best tables, located next to a large window overlooking the main street, sat Aziza and her father, President Thaddeus King. Aziza's appearance was much more charming and dignified than a year ago. She was elegantly dressed in a modern outfit from a renowned designer that matched perfectly with a softly patterned silk scarf. Her face was clean and naturally radiant, emanating unmistakable inner peace and happiness. There was no trace of sadness, mental pressure, or swollen eyes, unlike when she was Romello's oppressed wife. Aziza was now a complete, independent, and respected woman. Today was a day of special celebration. Aziza had just inaugurated the 5th branch of her fashion boutique, which had become a trend among young women. The business, which she had started again with her own capital and her father's strategic guidance, had grown very quickly in a short time. She had proven to the world, and especially to herself, that she could stand firm on her own feet without the shadow of her father's great name. Mr. King looked at his daughter with overflowing pride and affection. The elderly gentleman looked healthy. His smile was wide and free as he listened to Aziza speak enthusiastically about her business expansion plans to enter the export market in neighboring countries. They laughed together, enjoying a chocolate cake dessert, celebrating a true victory in life. For Mr. King, seeing his daughter break free from a harmful parasite and become a strong woman was incalculable happiness, much more valuable than any luxury car he had bought. Amidst their warm and laughing conversation, Aziza's gaze casually drifted toward the huge window beside them. The glass, thick and soundproof, perfectly separated two opposing worlds. The quiet, fragrant, and luxurious world inside the restaurant, and the noisy, hot, dusty, and cruel world outside. On the sidewalk of the avenue in front of the restaurant, there was a huge traffic jam due to lunch hour. Aziza saw a small altercation in an illegal parking zone, not far from the restaurant lobby entrance. An illegal valet dressed in an old, torn orange vest full of grease was being harshly scolded by the owner of a luxury sedan who claimed his car had been scratched by a passing motorcycle. The valet bowed his head deeply, asking for forgiveness with a very miserable and scared gesture. He clasped his hands in front of his chest several times, pleading not to be beaten or reported. The valet's skin was dark, burnt by the scorching sun. His hair was messy and long, full of street dust, and his body was very thin, like someone suffering from chronic malnutrition. His cheekbones protruded sharply, and his eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles. Aziza narrowed her eyes, trying to recognize a familiar figure behind that ragged appearance. The next instant, Aziza was startled. It was Romello, her ex-husband, who once always went impeccable with ironed shirts, elegant suits, and expensive watches. Now he stood on the hot asphalt without decent shoes, taking insults and spit from another person for a $2 coin. Aziza's heart shuddered, but the tremor wasn't due to residual love or emerging nostalgia, but strange pity like one feels seeing a stranger suffering. Aziza's gaze drifted to the sidewalk opposite where Romello was. There, an old woman in old clothes and faded pajamas was sitting on her knees. She was selling small packs of tissues and masks to passers-by with a pitiful face. Her face was covered in street dust and sweat. Her wrinkles had become deeper, but Aziza could still recognize Ms. Corinne's features very clearly. The woman who once boasted proudly of her imitation bags in malls and insulted Aziza at every social club meeting, calling her barren and stupid, now had to extend her hand on the street, hoping for people's compassion, to buy a pack of tissues for $1. The scene contrasted too much with the last memory Aziza had of them. It was as if an invisible thread, or perhaps fate, wanted to show her the end of the play. Romello, who had just been reprimanded by the car owner, turned his head toward the luxury restaurant building. Maybe he wanted to escape the scorching sun for a moment, or maybe he just wanted to see the comfortable life he could no longer enjoy. His eyes pierced the transparent glass and met directly with Aziza's, who was looking at him. For Romello, time seemed to stop. He froze on the spot. His feet seemed nailed to the hot asphalt. Romello saw his ex-wife sitting in there. So beautiful, clean, radiant, and happy. He saw Aziza surrounded by the luxury he once felt and wasted. He saw that the delicious food on Aziza's table probably cost the same as his income for 3 months carrying sacks and parking cars. Shame, extreme regret, and the collapse of his ego hit Romelo's chest so hard he ran out of breath and felt nauseous. He saw clearly what he had thrown overboard to follow his mother's irrational pride and greed. He wanted to scream. He wanted to call Aziza, wanted to run inside, kneel, and beg to be allowed back to the past. But he realized that thick glass was a wall of destiny he could no longer cross. He was just dust outside, while Aziza was a diamond in the window display. Romelo saw that Miss Corinne had also turned and covered her mouth in astonishment. Tears of regret ran down her dirty, wrinkled cheeks. Aziza held Romelo's tear-filled gaze for a few long seconds. On Aziza's face there was no anger, no smile of satisfied mockery, no burning vengeance. There was only a blank and serene look, the look of someone viewing a past that has ended and no longer has the slightest place in her life. Aziza slowly looked away, unilaterally breaking that eye contact. She looked back at her father. Mr. King had also noticed Romelo's presence outside, but chose not to give it importance. Mr. King simply nodded and smiled at his daughter, a silent signal that everything had passed. Aziza returned her father's smile softly, and then, with an elegant and determined gesture, called the restaurant waiter. When the waiter approached, Aziza asked him to close the window blinds, as the sunlight was too dazzling. The waiter nodded politely and slowly pulled the blind cord. The thick golden fabric descended inch by inch, slowly hiding the view of the street, blocking Romelo's vision of Aziza, and separating the bright light inside the restaurant from the painful heat outside. The blind closed firmly, and for Aziza, the book of her past also closed forever. Meanwhile, for Romelo and his mother, life in regret was a prison without bars they would have to endure until the day they died. In a modest coffee shop on the outskirts of the produce market, Romelo sat lost in thought with an empty gaze. His appearance was now much older than his actual age. His hair, once thick and black, was now graying and thinning in some areas. The skin on his face was weathered by the sun, and his teeth were yellowed from smoking too much to relieve stress. He wore a faded political t-shirt and worn-out shorts. In front of him was a cup of watery black coffee and a cold donut, the only breakfast he could afford before returning to his vegetable loading job. The noise of the market and the shouts of merchants sounded like the background music of his gloomy life. Romelo's attention drifted when the coffee shop owner turned up the volume on an old tube TV placed on a dusty shelf. The morning news was broadcasting a special report profiling an inspiring businesswoman who had triumphed in the global market. Romelo's heart seemed to stop when he saw the face that appeared on the screen. It was Aziza, but the Aziza he saw on TV was very different from the one he knew. She was so elegant, dignified, and radiant, with an aura of true happiness. Aziza was being interviewed on the patio of a luxurious house, much larger than Mr. King's old house, surrounded by a beautiful flower garden. The camera focused on the figure standing next to Aziza, a handsome man with a kind smile and a tender look holding an adorable toddler in his arms. It was Aziza's new husband, a renowned architect known for being a religious and very family-oriented person. In the interview, Aziza, with shining eyes, said her success was due to the prayers and support of her current husband, who always treated her like a queen and asked for nothing more than their happiness together. Aziza also mentioned that, as a devotion from her dark past, she had just created a social foundation to help women suffering from family abandonment. In that success story, Romelo's name was not mentioned a single time. For Aziza, Romelo had been completely erased from history. He was nothing more than a small stone that made her stumble before she could finally run at full speed. Romello felt immense pressure in his chest, as if a large rock were crushing his lungs. He saw how perfect Aziza's life was. Now he saw true love in her new husband's eyes, something Romello never gave her, too busy chasing his mother's pride. Regret hit him like a huge wave hitting a rock, but this time the wave drowned him. Romello remembered Ms. Corinne, who had been bedridden for a year, paralyzed in their cramped rental apartment after suffering a mild stroke. His mother, once so arrogant, now only cried and raved in dreams, spending her old age in an adult diaper rarely changed due to lack of money and without any of her high society friends coming to visit her. With trembling hands, Romello left some coins on the coffee shop table and stood up, leaving behind the TV broadcast that still showed the happy laughter of Aziza's little family. He went out into the humid bustle of the market and loaded a heavy sack of onions onto his shoulders again. A light drizzle began to fall, hiding the tears that finally rolled down Romello's cheeks. He realized the hardest punishment wasn't poverty, but the awareness that he once held a diamond in his hands, but threw it away for a stone he thought was gold. Now he had to spend the rest of his life watching someone else's happiness from afar while he circled in the maze of endless regret. His story ended with justice perfectly written by fate. Did you like the story, and which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.